Welcome to Off Hours, a conversation between John Edwards and Chris Manning.
As a bit of an offshoot to our episode on casting, I've had the opportunity since then to have a chat with a German jeweler I know who's quite well versed in the craft, casting and silversmithing, goldsmithing in general. And in talking to him, one of the interesting things that he mentioned to me that I wasn't aware of is that zinc turns out to be a really handy element to add to metals when they're casting. In particular, he was talking about casting rose gold and variants of yellow gold. But what the zinc does, from what he was telling me, is it just allows the alloy to become more liquid, more fluid as it's going into the cast. So it just flows better throughout the cast that you're trying to make. The trick, though, is that if your temperature's not quite right, so it's got to be Goldilocks. If it's too hot, then it becomes brittle. If it's too cold, it doesn't flow well. To me, it was more the post-processing side of things that I found interesting about this, because you don't have to worry about having zinc in your alloy if you're just rolling and cutting and forming the metal with a hammer. But if you're casting something, the example that he gave is he went to basically have the piece assayed afterwards. So basically putting a stamp or hammering a stamp mark into the shaft of a ring that he had cast using one of the first times that he had done a zinc-based rose gold alloy. And he said that the ring literally shattered on him just because it formed sort of a crystalline structure. Whereas that wouldn't have been an issue at all for an alloy that had no zinc in it. So it just was interesting for me to hear that, and it also sort of drove home for me the differences that an alloy can make. For instance, when you're looking at a repeating watch that chimes the time for you, making those cases in the old-fashioned way, watchmakers swear by the fact that you get better tonal notes just because of the structure of the metal. And it makes a lot of sense. If you're casting something versus forging something, the internal atomic structure is quite different. So I don't know if you had any thoughts there.
I don't do a lot of alloying of gold. There just isn't enough demand in what I'm doing. I do play around with some silver alloys. We don't use zinc in silver alloys at all. There just isn't the need for it. So what the zinc is doing is it's lowering the surface tension of the, or at least that's my guess, is that it's lowering the surface tension of the metal, and that's allowing it to flow better into the mold itself. And that's a challenge. One of the things we'll talk about in a later episode is niello, which is a silver alloy that I use as an inlay in some of my pieces. Having a high surface tension is a huge problem in there, and that's something that I'm working on trying to fix. And so when you're making an alloy for casting, there are certain wetting agents and metals that you can add to it to reduce the surface tension, and again make it so that it sort of flows better. The zinc that I've had problems with in the past is from brass. Brass has zinc in it. One of the issues that I find with that is brass has a fairly high melting temperature, and the zinc tends to burn off. And one of the things you have to be very careful of, now there's a lot more zinc in brass than there is in the rose gold, for instance, that this gentleman is casting in. And one of the things you have to be careful of when that zinc burns off is you don't want to inhale the fumes from zinc. You can tell there's zinc burning in there because you get this greenish blue flame that comes up off the top of the metal. I've had zinc poisoning once when I was working with some metal that I thought was a bronze, which doesn't have zinc in it. It has tin in it, but it was a brass instead. The company that sold it to me had mislabeled it. And you get a lungful of that, and it feels like you have a really bad flu for a couple of days. And it's nasty stuff. In the quantities that you're using in gold and rose gold, then you don't have to worry about it too much. But you do need to be careful about it. If you're casting brass, you want to make sure that you're not inhaling those fumes. And as you say, with structure, grain structure of the metal, anytime I can, I try to work with a metal that's been work hardened, that's been mechanically formed, just because it is so much stronger. So if you're casting something, it's more porous than something that's been compressed. So if you're rolling it on a mill, for instance, if you're making sheet, you'll cast that as an ingot, and that'll be, that metal will be kind of porous. And as you roll that sheet or that ingot down in a rolling mill into sheet, you might compress it from, let's say, 5 or 6 millimeters thick into a sheet that's a millimeter thick. So you're reducing its cross section considerably. And in that process, you're compressing the metal into a finer and finer grain structure, and it becomes much stronger. In my case, I will then go off and deep draw it, which we can talk about it in a future episode, but effectively you're using a hydraulic press to mechanically shape it from a flat sheet into a tube or a cylinder. And again, that process of working the metal, of moving it into a different shape without melting it, changes the grain structure of the metal, and it makes it considerably harder than something that you've cast. So there's a lot of alchemy involved in metals and in alloys, and it's one of those things that they're people who spend a lot of their professional life working on different alloys and working on different metals and trying to figure out how to improve the quality of metals. When I was at the Santa Fe Symposium earlier in the year, there were a few talks related to white gold. White gold is one of those metals that people are always looking for, a gold that is very, very white in color. Unfortunately, silver tends not to be as hard as a lot of the golds, as a lot of the white golds, but it's also much whiter than the white golds. It also isn't as valuable, and so isn't as desirable in something like a watch. So there's a lot of work being done in trying to make white golds whiter, but you run into other problems where you then make them very brittle. You make it so that you can't machine them or you can't roll them. There are a lot of challenges with alloying, and it's an interesting science. And again, science. There's a lot of science involved in it, but at the end of the day, there's also some alchemy in there. There's some that unknown in terms of what do you add in here? What do you why do you add this little bit there? Why do you add that little bit there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even just trying to get an even distribution of elements within an alloy based on all their melting temperatures and the way that they interact with each other on a molecular level can be quite a challenge as well. Even just as you said there with the zinc burning off.
When you start adding different metals together, so for instance, you take sterling silver, which is 92.5% silver and 7.5% copper. The sterling silver melts at a lower temperature than either pure silver or pure copper. So sometimes you get weird things happening like that where it doesn't necessarily make sense that the two things would have a lower melting temperature when you add them together. And that melting temperature will change dramatically depending on what the percentages are. In my case, I use a lot of argentium. Argentium has a little bit more silver in it, an extra percent of silver, so it's 93.5%. But it also has a little bit of germanium in it. I think it's like 1.5% germanium, something like that. And again, that germanium dramatically changes the properties of the metal. It's not a lot by weight, but it's enough that the alloy doesn't tarnish as quickly. It becomes harder, so you can work harden it more. The melting temperature drops a little bit, but then it also becomes more fragile. If you try quenching it when it's red hot, you'll make it very, very brittle. Alloying metals is an interesting problem, and it's something that I'm learning more and more about, but it's a deep subject that that's difficult to know everything about.
Yeah, absolutely. And even metallurgists and material specialists dedicate their lives to this subject.
Absolutely.
It's essentially an infinite area of exploration, all the different ways that you can combine elements together.
If people are interested in reading more about more authoritative work about alloying, I highly recommend going to the Santa Fe Symposium website. One of the wonderful things about that symposium, all of the papers since 2000, so the last 17 years worth of papers, are all available for free on their website. Anyone can go in and download them. They're all there as PDFs. So there's been some excellent talks. Chris Cordy in particular, he was over from the UK, and he's given a number of talks over the years about metallurgy. And speaking about all different metals, there were 3 or 4 this year that were talking about different metals and the metallurgy behind them. So if people are interested in reading more about it and reading from people who actually know what they're talking about instead of someone like me who's a rank amateur when it comes to metallurgy, I highly recommend people check out those papers. They're worth reading.
Now, back to the zinc poisoning there, did you have to seek medical attention for that, or is it something that just wore off over?
Should I have sought medical attention? Probably. I didn't. I just, I knew what it was. I had spoken to a few friends who'd had the same problem, and I just took a couple days off from the shop, and it was okay. And then went back into the shop a couple days later, and there's this sort of fine zinc powder over everything from the the fumes that have precipitated out. So it depends obviously on how serious it is. In this case, it was relatively minor, and I didn't have any long-term effects from it, but the short-term effects were definitely nasty. It feels like a really bad flu, so it really gets into your lungs and affects you there. So I definitely recommend anytime you're working with anything that has any large amounts of zinc in it, if you're dealing with lead, a lot of different things that are going to be hazardous to you, make sure that especially if you're heating them to the point where they're melting, be sure to work inside of a fume hood or work in a very well ventilated shop so that you're not dealing with the side effects of that.
Switching gears a bit here, you and I both recently were able to catch La Machine here in Ottawa.
Yeah, we're fortunate that the city of Ottawa decided to bring La Machine, which is I guess a live performance troupe from France. I think we got the first visit of this particular group in North America.
Mm-hmm. It was absolutely phenomenal, mind-boggling, really, to see these things come to life. The first I'd ever heard of La Machine was an elephant that they had paraded, which also, I believe, toured the world. The 2 beasts that they brought over here was a giant spider and a dragon that arrived without wings, but then went and found its wings. And these 2 beasts sort of faced off after roaming the streets of the city for a couple of days.
Yeah, and I guess we should describe the machines a little bit. These are large mechanical puppets, effectively, that are driven through hydraulics. And when I say large, I mean several stories tall when they rear up and they're sort of at their full height, and they're incredibly impressive up close. I was fortunate; I saw the performance on Sunday afternoon, and I was right at the barrier for when the spider came by. Its legs were over top of my head. I could have jumped up and grabbed onto one of these legs. I was that close to it. Incredibly skilled puppeteers, because each of the limbs and each of the elements is controlled by a separate puppeteer who's on the machine itself. And they did a spectacular job of that. And one of the things that really impressed me about the performance, not only do they have these unbelievable puppets that they're controlling and sort of driving through the streets, but they also had a live musical performance with it as well. So they have a small orchestra, effectively, that are sort of riding behind this giant spider as it's moving through the streets, and giving a live music performance at the same time. And it was the combination was quite spectacular.
Mm-hmm. And into that mix, you throw a bit of fire and smoke and bubbles and water and steam. It was quite the show. Certainly unforgettable. It left quite an impression on just about anyone I've spoken to about it. And in terms of the crowds and the density of the crowds, because this is a very singularly focused event, unlike Canada Day, where there are things going on all over the city, but just the way everyone was pressing in to get a good close look at these things, it was just the sheer number of people. And all the restaurants downtown actually ran out of food. Like, I've heard of a single restaurant here or there running out of food, but to have pretty much every restaurant downtown completely out of food was mind-boggling as well. And it's a testament just the sheer number of people who came to check it out.
It's impressive. The Ottawa's really a pretty sleepy town after hours. At least downtown Ottawa is. The market is a good place to go if you're around in the evening and you want to you want some entertainment or you want to go to a good bar or restaurant. But as you say, Canada Day is one of the events that we get a large number of people at, and I've never seen that many people downtown except at a big Canada Day celebration. It was just incredible, the number of people. And I think they estimated over 4 days there were 750,000 people that gathered for the shows in total. So that's impressive in a city that's a little over 1 million people. That's a sizable turnout. So if you happen to see La Machine coming through your part of the world, and I think it's sort of touring around North America. This particular show is touring around North America. If you happen to be close by, it's worthwhile making the trip to go to it.
Yeah,
It's remarkable.
Now sounds like you got a good close-up look at the spider. Did you get very close to the dragon as well?
We were probably 20 or 30 feet from the dragon as well. It was fascinating seeing how they created this these puppets and seeing the motion that they're able to get out of it. It's quite exquisite. Like they're very complicated movements that they're able to get out of these puppets.
Yeah, that really look like they come to life.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was able to get up nice and close with the dragon while it was sleeping when it first arrived here in town. That was the closest I was able to get. If I wanted to, I could have reached out and touched it, but I was able to get a good look at the full length of it and all the intricate details in the way that it's put together and built. And even when it was just there resting, it was really neat to see. It had this really deep, bassy, breathing sound and the odd bit of smoke that would puff out of it.
Yeah, it was amazing how expressive it was when so we were there when the dragon woke up on the Sunday performance, and again, it's incredible how expressive the puppet is. It's obviously huge steel, contraption. I think they're probably using fiberglass for a lot of the exterior, but they did an impressive job with the expressiveness of the machine. And if you know anybody that was in Ottawa this weekend, I'm sure you got sick and tired of seeing photos of this thing. I know a few friends in Toronto were getting tired of seeing all the cool dragon shots because for Canada 150, Toronto decided to bring in a big rubber ducky, and I think they were a little jealous of our dragon when they got the big rubber ducky.
I look forward to seeing what La Machine comes up with in the future too, if they continue. I mean, they certainly seem to have been successful with everything they've done thus far. It'd be neat to see how this evolves further.
Now, one of the things we wanted to talk about is watchmaking. We wanted to get a little bit more into that. I think for a lot of people, the term watchmaker is a bit of a mystery because I think for most people, when they hear the term watchmaker, they think about somebody who's making a watch from scratch. But that's not really what a watchmaker does, is it? Why don't you describe a little bit? What are the kinds of things that you do, sort of on a regular basis as a watchmaker?
Yeah, the title watchmaker is a bit of a misnomer. I tend to try and avoid calling myself one. However, it's a generally accepted term for what it is that I do. So when it comes to filling out something like a census or answering the classic dinner party question of, so what do you do? And I don't particularly feel like getting into exactly what it is that I do. I do find watchmaker serves as a handy shorthand. Making a watch, like truly making a watch from the raw material as a single individual, is supremely rare. To be honest, I don't know for certain if anyone has ever actually done it. I mean, not even a watchmaker as prolific as George Daniels, who literally wrote the book on watchmaking, crafted every last component of the watches himself.
Yeah, I think it's pretty challenging to do that, especially when you start dealing with springs and watch crystals made out of sapphire and things like that. It becomes a bit of a challenge, and I think these days, when you hear about people who are crafting watches from scratch, somebody like, let's say, Roger Smith, for instance, I think you'll find that most people sort of concede that sort of 98% of it or whatever is being made by them, and then there are a few things like the crystals and the springs that they're getting made for them, just because the specialization in metallurgy or in materials is just too challenging to deal with on an individual level.
And that's just it. And I think specialists really hits the nail on the head there. I mean, both Daniels and Roger Smith source things like the hairsprings for their watches from specialists.
Right.
And any sufficiently advanced tool or technology is not product of any one single person or company. We've advanced as a civilization because of specialization.
Well, and to be fair, when you look at the history of watchmaking, when especially you take a look, let's say, at the classic thought of the Swiss watchmaker, let's say Abraham Louis Breguet, like that era of watchmaking, they weren't individual people making an entire watch. They were people making pinions, there were people making gears, there were people making cases, and they were sort of a cottage industry of people doing very specialized things, and then somebody bringing those parts together and assembling them into a finished watch. But even the classic thought of the classic watchmaker 300 years ago wasn't making the whole watch themselves.
The specialization of a watchmaker, I would say, is getting the optimal performance out of all these disparate cogs and springs that they're putting together, to the extent that all these parts operate together so harmoniously and with such predictable regularity that they can measure the passage of time. And to reach that level of performance, a watchmaker needs to have a fundamental understanding of how these components are made, and also the properties of the materials that the various parts are made from. So when someone does ask to know more about what I do beyond a rote answer like I work with watches or I'm a watchmaker, I tend to liken what I do to that of someone who is able to take an old rusty car that hasn't run in decades and bring it back to showroom condition. Only the watchmaker's job isn't quite finished when the wheels start turning for the first time. That's really when the watchmaker's job begins, because it's only once the watch starts ticking does the more challenging work of actually getting it to keep time begin.
What kind of condition then do you typically receive watches in? I mean, obviously you're gonna find things in all sorts of different conditions, everything, I'm sure, from stuff that's been left in a drawer for 50 years to stuff that people are actively wearing. But typically are these watches functioning at all, or are they, do they just need a bit of a clean and tune, or what kind of condition do you typically get watches in?
I wouldn't say there is a typical condition. That's part of what I like about what I do, is every day is delivering something different for me to work on. It's rare that I'll get a piece in that doesn't need any new parts or any parts to be touched up or bushings closed or things like that. More often than not, there are pivots that are worn out because people have let the watch run long enough and let the lubricants inside the watch degrade to such an extent that they stop doing what they're intended to do, which is to eliminate friction, actually crystallize, and they begin to have an almost abrasive effect on the components that they're supposed to be lubricating. So, for instance, in the past month, I've had one piece come in that needed no new parts. It was just standard maintenance. I took the whole watch apart, cleaned and inspected everything, put it all back together, fresh lubrication, slight timing adjustment, monitored it for a few days, and it was good to go. On the other hand, had some pieces come in that were not running or operative at all when they came in. Had pieces come in that were severely stricken by moisture, so they were beginning to corrode. So there's a lot to clean up there. Yeah, it really varies, and the age can vary quite a bit as well, from something come in for its first service after only been in operation for in the range of 5 to 7 years to something that's been around for 120, 150 years and is needing some work done on it.
Right. Now, with these watches that need work done on parts, are you fabricating new parts? Are you purchasing new parts? Like, is this something where you can easily get parts for these watches?
It really depends on the particular watch. For the most part, it's more economical, both for the person working on the watch as well as for the client who owns the watch, to be able to get parts directly from the factory that first made the watch. For pieces that were made in the last 25, 30, 40 years, that's generally the best route. For watches that are older than that, you'll often find that parts are no longer in production, have been out of production for decades, and you just can't find the components anymore. And in those cases, we resort to making parts on a one-off basis. But you're generally looking at a multiple, I would say, of at least 4, sometimes a 10x multiple on what it would cost to purchase a replacement part that was done by a CNC machine or a machine that was set up specifically to make that one part 100,000 times versus us measuring and making it as a one-off component.
Making one of something or 10 of something is quite challenging. Making 100,000 of something is actually quite easy because you design a machine that does nothing but make that spring or does nothing but cut the teeth on a gear. I think that's something that most people don't quite realize when they talk about making things. They think about, in most cases, making something in large numbers. They think it's quite challenging, but for the most part, that's actually quite easy until you get into the scale of somebody like an Apple, where you need to be able to produce 60 million of them for a 3-month period. When a new iPhone comes out or something, at that point you then have serious problems of scale. It's a significant challenge to produce that many. But when you're dealing with 100,000 of something, it's actually much easier to do that than it is to produce 10 or 100 of something.
Yeah, with the scale that Apple's working at, you cross over that bell curve on the economies of scale to the total other side of the spectrum, where you're actually starting to get into diseconomies of scale, where your scale is actually working against you. So in terms of the word watchmaker, sort of the commonly used word, I have heard the term watchsmith used to describe what I do, but personally I find that to be even more disingenuous than watchmaker, as smithing generally entails hammering and forging of metals, which very few watch manufacturers, let alone individual watchmakers, ever do.
And really, smithing isn't an appropriate technique for that kind of thing. I have done a little bit of silversmithing in the past, where in that case I was raising objects like a cup from a flat sheet with a hammer, and something like that is smithing work. And even the work that I do, some people call me a silversmith or a goldsmith, but that's really inappropriate for the work I do as well. So the term smith, I know it's something that's commonly used with people who make things in a particular field, but it's often misused and inappropriate. So yeah, I like the sound of the term watchsmith, but I don't think it's really appropriate for this kind of work.
I like the sound of the term whitesmith, which is actually a very old term. A number of the very first watch and clock makers were called whitesmiths. They were essentially blacksmiths who post-processed and polished the iron that they were forging, ridding it of the black carbon scale that builds up on the metal as you're forging it until the metal shone through bright and shiny and white. Paradoxically, the highest level of polishing fine watchmaking today is referred to as a black polish.
Right.
Which is essentially a surface that is polished so perfectly smooth and flat that it can reflect light without diffusion, such that it appears to be perfectly black when you view it from just the right angle. So I find the term whitesmith appealing, but it's not something I could come to call myself.
I think there would be, it's esoteric enough that I think you'd have a difficult time making people understand what it is that you're doing if you use that term. I think it's too far out of people's lexicon for that to be a useful term.
And over time, it came to more generally refer to tinsmiths or other smiths who worked in white metals, primarily tinsmiths. I wouldn't be surprised to learn if aluminum workers were also called whitesmiths at some point, but aluminum, or aluminium as they would have called it in England, was exceedingly rare back then. It was valued even more highly than gold. But now today we know it to be one of the most abundant, if not the most abundant metal that's found on the planet. To put a bow on things, a watchmaker knows how to make every component in a watch, and they know how all those components work together, but it's prohibitively expensive for one person to make every single component in a watch. That's not to say it's impossible. There are people who come very close, like Roger Smith, but I mean, if you want to get yourself a Roger Smith, you're looking at an entry-level price in the high 5 figures. So most watch parts are fabricated on an industrial scale with industrial equipment and then assembled into a finished product by a watchmaker. So the bulk of my work is in the service and restoration of mechanical timepieces. And if I happen to need to make a one-off part for a particular watch, I do. So most watchmaking schools will train their students on how to fabricate the most common parts in a watch that tend to wear or break.
So you talked about people leaving a watch too long and lubrication drying out. What is that the sort of the greatest sin that people perform on their watches, that they leave them running too long and they don't have them lubricated regularly? Is that probably the biggest problem that you see with watches coming in?
Yeah, that would be the biggest cause of wear and tear in a watch movement. Like it's a really well-made watch, like a Rolex, will run for 30 years. And because it's so well engineered, you're not going to know there's a problem until it has literally ground itself to a stop. And like pushing a watch out 30 years, it's like 6 times the effective length of the lubricants that are inside the watch. I mean, you can push it to 7 years. 10 years, you're more than likely going to be looking at some wear on a number of the parts. I mean, to put it into a bit of perspective too, the balance wheel in a watch, depending on how fast the watch is tuned to be running, it's going to be upwards of 500,000 times a day that wheel is flitting back and forth. And it's flitting back and forth on pivots that are smaller than the diameter of a human hair. And you run the math on that, and over the serviceable lifetime of the lubricant, that balance wheel will have been able to turn around the circumference of the Earth several times. And this is all happening with such a small quantity of lubricant. I saw a stat a few years ago. I can't remember the precise brand it was, but it was one of the bigger brands like Rolex, where the amount of lubricant that they used for their entire production for a full year was something like 10 liters.
Wow. And that's something I don't think a lot of people realize, is that in a lot of cases, more lubricant is better. You know, I know when I'm using lubricant for turning, or you know, I'm lubricating, let's say the headstock of a lathe or the ways on my lathe. You know, putting a little bit too much lubricant on there is rarely a bad thing, and it's usually better than not having enough. But in watchmaking, if you're applying too much lubricant, that is just as bad as not having enough, right?
Yeah, precisely. It's just like heating up the zinc that we were talking about at the beginning of the show. There's a sort of Goldilocks amount of lubricant that you want to get in there. Too much lubricant and capillary action will actually begin to start drawing the lubricant away from what it is you're trying to keep lubricated. So I mentioned watchmaking schools there and sort of what they teach. And each school's a little bit different in the curriculum that they teach and the things that they'll focus on. But most of them will run you through making replacement parts for a timepiece. Going back a few shows, you were encouraging people that you know, if this was something that interested them to go ahead and pursue it. So I would say that if you are interested in pursuing a career in watchmaking or watch service or restoration, there are a number of excellent options at your disposal. Most schools today are sponsored by watchmaking conglomerates like Swatch or Richemont Group. So the tuition is free. You'll pay for your hand tools, which will cost you about $3,000 or so. But those tools are yours to keep and will be able to serve you for a lifetime for the most part. And you also make a number of tools throughout your training that you'll also get to keep, and that will also serve you throughout your career. One of the premier entities as far as watch schools go would be WOSTEP, which stands for the Watchmakers of Switzerland Training and Education Program. And they have a number of partner schools around the world, most of which are brand sponsored. So the Swatch and the Richemont schools will have partnered with WOSTEP. So you'll be following the WOSTEP curriculum at those schools.
There are a few sort of, not competing organizations, but I guess similar organizations around the world that are trying to create a curriculum that's effective for the watchmaking industry. I'm currently going through the British Horological Institute's course, and the reason I chose to use theirs is because they have a distance learning program, which is something that unfortunately the WOSTEP program does not have any kind of distance learning. So if you're in a situation like me where in my case, I can't afford to give up 3 years to go and go back to school. There are programs out there that, like the BHI, that have ways of learning that. Now, of course, it is challenging because in my case, I'm reading through material, and they do have tutors that you can hire to assist you with learning. But you are teaching a lot of this to yourself. So if you're a little bit more mechanically inclined already, in my case, I'm already a skilled machinist, and so teaching myself some of these skills, it's a little bit easier. I already know how to use a lathe, but that certainly is a challenge. And they do have short courses, like a 5-day course on, let's say, disassembling and cleaning, a simple ETA 2824 movement, or, an introduction to the watchmaker's lathe or something like that. And it, might be a 5-day course. So that can be a good solution for people who maybe don't have the ability to give up 3 years for a school.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the National Association of Watch and Clock Collectors down in the United States, the NAWCC, also runs a school that has some short courses that they provide. The American Watch and Clock Makers Institute, the AWCI, is another one that does some short courses. If you're in NYC, New York, the Horological Society of New York also offers a free intro to watchmaking course, and that's actually been touring around the United States as of late, so popping up in places like Miami and San Francisco for a weekend. Another is the Swiss American Watchmakers Training Alliance, SATA. That's a Rolex-backed initiative. So Rolex has partnered with a number of schools under SATA, and these schools are also tuition-free. And Rolex itself operates the Lidditz Watch Technicum in Pennsylvania, which is a phenomenal school if you can get in. But because of the detailed nature of the training at most of these schools, the ratio of teachers to students, even in the short courses, is generally incredibly low, which is great. But this, coupled with the often free tuition, also means that competition for positions in these programs is high.
Right. Now, with a program that is being sponsored by, let's say, Rolex or Richemont or somebody like that, are they typically offering jobs to these students afterwards, or is there an expectation that you work for the company for a certain number of years afterwards, or what is that kind of relationship like?
You're not guaranteed to be given a job or offered a job by the sponsoring brand or organization. And they also don't bind you in any way. So once you've graduated, you're free to go on and work wherever you please. I know at Lidditz, they actually have a service center that is based right there as well. So some students do graduate from there and go right to working for Rolex. Others want to get out of Amish country as quickly as they can. So they'll head off to a big city and work for a boutique or something, or they'll strike out on their own and open up their own shop and go about things that way.
I guess for the brands, it's a great opportunity to find the talented watchmakers as they're coming out, because obviously as we've mentioned, there's a huge demand for watchmakers, and I guess if you're sponsoring these companies, of course you gain the benefit of just having people in the industry, but if there's a particularly talented watchmaker coming out of there, I guess you get sort of your first crack at hiring them.
Exactly. And I think that's kind of along the lines of the premise of the training program that Patek has launched in New York City. And that is particularly hard to get into. And they only open up spaces every 2 years. And the first class will just be coming up on graduation in the coming year. And they're based at Patek Philippe's New York City service center. So they've got a classroom there with, I believe, 6 students that they're training. And I believe each and every one of them will have the opportunity to go on to work for Patek there in New York, should they wish. Another excellent school is actually the Finnish School of Watchmaking in Espoo. It's graduated some of the top talent working at well-known firms basically around the world, primarily in Switzerland and Germany. And not to mention also graduating world-class watchmakers like Kari Voutilainen.
Yeah, I was going to say there are a few really talented Finnish watchmakers out there that have made quite the name for themselves, and I know there aren't a lot of them, but the ones who are making a name for themselves, they're quite talented.
Yeah, there's Kari and Stepan Sarpaneva, Mika Rissanen, I believe he works for Maître du Temps. Torsti Line, he was an IT professional turned watchmaker. And N.T. Ronco is another one. He produced one of his first timepieces was, I believe, the Steel Labyrinth. It's a great program, really talented students coming out of there. And they have a partnership with another school in Germany that I believe is based in Glashütte. And they get to go there and spend some time honing their skills there with some of the German watchmakers. There are, of course, a number of great options in Switzerland, including the KHWCC, whose alumni have gone on to work for numerous big brands as well as for independent watchmakers like Roger W. Smith. And then, of course, like you mentioned, there's a good number of correspondence courses available too. And I've seen the odd online course offered, but it's generally more for sort of amateur watchmaking and just sort of getting a feel for what it's like to take a movement apart and put it back together. The BHI course is excellent. I think you made a good pick there.
I've been impressed with the material. Now, it's interesting because they have sort of two programs. There's sort of the introduction program, and then the intermediate and advanced program is the second one. They've gone through and rewritten the beginner's course, and it's excellent. I love the material that they've got in that. And I know that they're working on rewriting the intermediate and advanced course, which I have a copy of right now, the old one. But it's a bit of a hodgepodge of articles and material that's been written over the last 40 years. So it's a bit of a mess right now in terms of just the flow of it, and there are things that are repeated a couple of times and whatnot. So yeah, the intermediate and advanced course is a bit of a challenge to sort of read through just from a continuity point of view. But their beginner's course has already been rewritten, and it is outstanding. I certainly recommend that if you're thinking about it. It's a relatively inexpensive way of getting a great sort of introduction into watchmaking, and you'll find out very quickly whether it's something that you're actually going to enjoy. And you get this huge volume of reading material. It's I think it works out to being somewhere around 1,300 pages of reading material. And they talk about a lot of things. They talk about the theory of watchmaking, the theory of how mechanical watches work, as well as a little bit of clockwork. So the BHI not only teaches watchmaking, but also clockmaking. If you go on to do the exams and get your certification through BHI, you choose whether you are going through the clock stream or the watch stream. There is a bit of both taught in all the courses, so you do learn a little bit about, for instance, if you're primarily interested in watches, you're still going to learn things about pendulum clocks, for instance, because it's such a fundamental principle of timekeeping that they want you to know and understand how a clock works as well. There's a lot of good information in there. As you mentioned, people are expected to make a couple of their own tools, and so they walk you through learning how to make some of those tools and whatnot as well. So yeah, it's an interesting program, and I haven't decided if I'm going to go through it and finish the actual diploma part of it and do the exams and do that. That's a bit onerous for me because it does involve they hold their exams once a year. I think typically in May every year, and so it involves going over to the UK for a couple of weeks to write exams. So I'm not sure if I'll ever get around to doing the exams proper, but even just having the knowledge and working through the courses, it's an excellent way to get into this industry.
Now, do they still offer the possibility of having another watchmaker, clockmaker oversee your exam pieces? I know of a clockmaker who had done the BHI course, and he had a sponsor clockmaker.
Yeah, they want you to. So one of the interesting things about the way that their program works, their distance learning program works, is that they expect you to do more than just pass the exams. You have pieces that you need to work on and send in. They also expect you to do restoration work on pieces. So you need to keep a log of the work that you've done on pieces. You need to document them. And typically you need to have an experienced watchmaker or clockmaker sort of look over the work that you've done and sort of confirm that it is in fact, up to the standards that are required, and that you've done the work that's necessary. just because you found one problem with a watch obviously doesn't mean that you found all the problems with a watch. And so, they want to know that you've actually done a good job with it, because at the end of the day, they want you to have skills, but they also want the people who are in the industry to be skilled enough to be doing competent work. You don't want somebody, who's got this, the BHI seal of approval and is doing substandard work. And so I don't know what's involved for those outside of the UK with finding, sponsoring watchmakers or clockmakers to sort of oversee the work that they're doing. I haven't looked into that enough yet, because I still haven't decided if I want to go down the road of actually getting the certification. But it is something that they can assist you with. I know that they can help find people that are a little bit more local to you. Now, it might be a challenge for somebody like me living in Ottawa, where I don't know if there are any other sort of BHI certified watchmakers anywhere near me. So that might be a challenge. If you're in the middle of nowhere, it might be I should say the middle of nowhere watch wise, sort of in the watch world. You may have a difficult time finding somebody. They do have tutors that you can pay to get access to. And so you can send your parts and your pieces into the BHI, and they have tutors who are local that then, sort of go through them and check them for the work, and they give you feedback on the work that you're doing. And they can be available electronically to, sort of answer your questions if you're struggling with something.
Have you done any of the practical exercises yet, or has it primarily been reading up to this point?
Yeah, at this point, I haven't done a lot of the practical work. I'm in an interesting situation right now. I have a shop that is sort of my messy shop right now, and it's I've converted a 2-car garage into a workspace that is I guess it's around 23 feet by 19 feet. And unfortunately, because of the kind of work that I do in there, I do a lot of machining in there. I do a lot of casting and things like that in there. And it's not conducive to doing delicate, clean watch work in a place like that. So I'm in the process of converting my basement into a sort of a quote-unquote clean studio for doing watch work and jewelry work. And so, or at least some parts of the jewelry work. Obviously, things like casting and polishing and whatnot, those are always going to be done sort of in the other shop. I've been reading the material and doing the theoretical part of it right now, and sort of rereading through parts of that, because of course there's a lot of theory behind watchmaking, a lot of math involved in figuring out how this stuff works. And once I've finally finished converting this basement studio into something that's usable, hopefully by the end of 2017, I'll have a usable space down there. And at that point, I'll be able to set up and actually get working on the practical side of it. When we talk about watchmaking, we often think about the Swiss as the, sort of the watchmaking world. But what other centers of watchmaking are there around the world? Like where would people typically find a lot of jobs in watchmaking, because that's where the industry is? What are the typical places that people might find work in sort of large factories or in brand centers?
Well, if you want a large factory, China's your place. Probably not the nicest working environment compared to the rolling hills and mountains of Switzerland. Germany, Glashütte is definitely a hotbed of fine watchmaking. And just over the border to France, from the Vallée de Joux, you've quite a high concentration of talent that's living there. And you've got a few small shops or brands, what have you, working there. Isle of Man in the UK, of course, that's Roger Smith and George Daniels.
There are a few English brands that are starting to try and come up again, and because England was at one point the world leader in watchmaking, and then sort of died out of, and that industry has sort of gone away to a large degree. But I think there are a few people trying to sort of bring watchmaking back natively on the island.
Mm-hmm. And the same holds true in the US as well. A number of young upstarts trying to bring a revival to that, because the USA used to be a titan in terms of watchmaking back in the heyday of the railroad and pocket watches. Well, the Swiss were actually quite intimidated by the level of automation that the Americans had brought to the scene. prior to the USA picking up watchmaking, interchangeable parts were just not, they were unthinkable. Kind of Switzerland and England were kind of the premier watchmaking centers in that era, and everything was sort of hand fit, hand adjusted. You get these raw Abosch movements, and everything would have to be custom fit and adjusted on a per piece basis. Kind of been interesting to see the way that things have transferred over the years. So England was quite prominent. France as well. That's where Breguet was based, and then you'd have partnerships between like Breguet and Arnold up in England. And another epicenter of watchmaking is, of course, Japan. We've got Seiko and Citizen. I mean, as far as vertically integrated manufacturers go, Seiko is one of the few on the planet. Rolex is another that comes to mind, where they can literally make everything that goes into a watch, from the hairspring to the mainspring to every single gear, all the case parts, crystals, the work.
And those are some of the few large manufacturers that aren't part of one of the two big conglomerates, either the Richemont group or the Swatch group. They're still independent of the big groups and are able to do all the work themselves, which is quite rare.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, most of the rest of the Swiss watch industry is dependent on the Swatch group's Niverox division for their balance assemblies and hairsprings and escapements. I mean, even Patek Philippe gets their Gyromax balance assemblies made by the Swatch group.
Yeah, and I've been doing some research into watch movements myself lately, because I'm thinking about using some for a line of watches, and even Eterna, who is in the process of trying to sort of replace ETA as the go-to suppliers for base movements for small brands. And even they get their balance wheels and springs from ETA. They're not making them themselves.
Kind of in a curious turn of events there. ETA is a spin-off from Eterna back in the early part of last century. So ETA is basically a concatenation of Eterna, and then they, through a series of split-offs and mergers and acquisitions, are two totally separate entities now. And ETA is owned by the Swatch Group and powers much of the Swiss watch industry, or has for pretty much decades, really. But now Eterna's kind of come in, and they're back into the game now that ETA is actually cutting off supply from other brands. Eterna has stepped up and is beginning to open up and become, or pretty much replace ETA as a supplier of movements, sort of the move that they're trying to make. So it's this interesting turn of events, especially because Eterna has since been acquired by a Chinese conglomerate. So things have sort of come full circle.
Yeah, they're doing some fascinating things with their movements, and I'm sure that's something that we're going to discuss more in the future, because it's I'm excited by what I'm seeing. I've been researching movement manufacturers for a few years now. It's been a challenge trying to find quality movements from people that are willing to sell anything from a handful to maybe 100 movements. And most of them are not doing particularly interesting things with movements in that scale. You need to be buying thousands of movements from them before you can get into customized complications and things like that in them. But the Eterna, especially the Caliber 39, is a fascinating attempt to make the customization of a movement possible without needing to buy thousands and thousands of movements from them. So yeah, I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about Eterna in the future. We'll have links to a lot of these watchmaking schools in the show notes, so that if you are curious about it, start doing some research in there, and we'll get good links in there so that you can hopefully find one that fits you.
And if you have any questions, you can feel free to send us a note at hello@offhours.show.
Thanks for listening to Off Hours. You can find detailed show notes at offhours.show. If you'd like to keep up to date with the show, follow us on Twitter @offhours. John can be found on Twitter @UnderTheLoop, and Chris can be found on Twitter and Instagram @silver_hand.